Alliance Insight is finally here, and the Yu-Gi-Oh! Metagame has changed drastically. Today, we're going to be discussing the best decks of the current format. With a brand new pack and a pretty recent ban list, things are a lot different than they were a while ago. In this tier list, we won't just be looking at what the best decks are, also how they impact the rest of the format. And just like my other Yu-Gi-Oh! Tier lists where I go over the best decks of the format, we don't just do tier 1, tier 2, S tier, or the sort. Instead, we more so look at what the driving forces are in the game, as well as what decks are just somewhat viable, what are war positioned, and what decks are just completely power corrupt out of the game. Now, before I get into the tier list, if you guys enjoy these discussions and tier lists, please make sure to let me know in the comment section down below, as well as I always welcome constructive criticism, because if you think anything should be different in this list, make sure you do so in a respectful manner. Remember, you can always say my opinion is wrong, just back it up with a reasoning, and no insults necessary. Let's be civil duelists for once. So, okay, what are the driving forces in this Alliance Insight format? Well, I think one of the biggest shapes of this format is actually going to be not Ryzel like before, but instead Malice. So, Alliance Insight had a few changes to it, but truthfully, not that many made much of a difference. One difference, however, that was completely huge is the release of Malice March Hare. This card gives much needed support to Malice, I'm being sarcastic there if it wasn't obvious, by giving them more names as well as more extenders that are searchable and recyclable, giving a deck pretty much anything it could want as far as extension. The Malice support didn't end there, because they also got Malice in the Mirror, a quick play spell that is okay, not huge, but then they also got some indirect support, which, let's be real, is pretty clearly designed for Malice, and that is a bunch of Ignister cards. Backup, Secretary, and Wizard Ignister, and the new Access Code Ignister monster are all criminally broken in Malice and cannot come out at a more convenient time for that strategy, giving Malice the ability to end on even more in terms of disruptions with Omni Negates, more follow-through with more bodies present on the field, better consistency with the small Ignister monsters, and better extension into specifically Artifact Lancia, with ways of extending that don't require you to banish cards. The overall changes in this deck have pushed it from what I think was a tier 1 threat to be close to a tier 0 threat. I think every deck should be designed to beat Malice. And on that note, obviously I'm filming this before the YCS, but as you guys are seeing this, you'll have the results to see how much my analysis has played out to fruition and how accurate my predictions are, because, yeah, obviously, timing. The biggest thing that I think this deck still can lack at sometimes is an ability to push through removal. It did get better extension to do that somewhat with the Ignister monsters. However, those monsters do require you to control a monster in your EMZ. It means that Malice's old problem of being weak to removal still exists. And in Malice, or against Malice, you were never holding your removal for the big links anyways. Your game plan was always, do not let them get to a link 3 and you'll be okay. In fact, it further makes negation unplayable versus Malice, because now you can turn it into a link 1 and then extend with Ignister cards. Removal, however, is still nearly as effective as before, because say you had a Book of Moon versus a Dormouse. Before you Book of Moon Dormouse, there wasn't too much that can be done past it. If you do it now, even with the Ignister cards and March Hare, Book of Moon on, say, a Dormouse doesn't give you much malleability to push past it. But that does mean it retains a somewhat weakness to removal, and I think that is a big thing to pay attention to in the format. Malice is very good, and I do think this is the absolute dominant driving force in this metagame, and nothing else can compare to it. However, as this format is positioned into what I'd call a close to tier 0 format, there are two other decks that I feel like fit the bill as tier 1, you can call them, or other driving forces that require some respect. And the first one is obvious, that is Ryzel. And now Ryzel obviously comes in many different variations, but the biggest thing we're looking at when it comes to Ryzel is how cards interact with two of the best cards in the deck, Ryzel Detonator and Ryzel X, or X Ryzel. I don't know why I said Ryzel X. These two cards are absolutely insane. Still, that part hasn't changed despite the balanced hits. Yes, they become a little more fragile, I guess, on the X to search, as well as the single detonator, meaning cards of Metatronus can be more impactful than before. However, these hits aren't impossible to overcome. And honestly, if this deck hadn't been hit at all, I still think it would end up falling short of Malice in this position. The Malice cards have such a huge upgrade in card quality, while Ryzel didn't get much. Did get something though. Obviously, we got Star Ryzel, brand new Ryzel, which, like Malice cards, make Veiler, Imperm, and Ash all kind of worse, because before, where you could use those cards to try and snipe down the Ryzel Duo Drive and stop access to Cross, that in theory doesn't work anymore. They can just starve for Cross and they're still going to have it, or they can use it to push through your hand trap on Duo Drive. Either way, making it so that your hand traps, especially negation ones, are significantly worse than they have been in the past. One thing the Ryzel Star does not really help with, though, where the Malice cards do help the Malice strategy with, is consistency. And you do obviously have 7th Ascension and 7th Tachyon to make up a lot of that difference, but it is clearly worse than just having more good starters, because they're weaker to Droll, they are neg 1, they're weaker to Ash, they're weaker to any negation, say even the new Access Code Talker. So yeah, the cards for Malice definitely got a way bigger boost than the cards for Ryzel. Still, Ryzel can't be ignored. Again, remember, Malice, I said, was not the best into removal. I still think that's true. Detonator may not be Book of Moon in the same position as before. In fact, it is 100% worse. It is still very good, and 3 materials with a Detonator can absolutely solo a fair bit of Malice hands, especially when you back it up with even more disruptions like the Cross, like maybe a Plasma Hole, a Baguska, a Ragna Zero. You'll have a lot more than just that, and the other hand traps are just icing on top. And then obviously, besides just Detonator, X Ryzel has been one of the best cards for a while, and it means summoning cards that are bad into X Aggregator can be kind of ill-advised. And while I expect Ryzel to be less popular and less successful than the Malice variants, I do think you need to keep in account for these 2 major interaction points, because you'll lose a lot of games to them still if you aren't well prepared. Now, the next lesser driving force that I've identified is one that can go with Ryzel or in other directions, and that is Mitsurugi. So this is one of the other huge talking points of Alliance Insight. Everyone was patiently waiting, seeing how good would the brand new Mitsurugi cards be. And come announcement day, everybody was pleasantly surprised by a wide array of options. Now, truthfully, a lot of them are actually not very good. However, Habakiri is the one that caught everybody's attention. It is exactly what Mitsurugi wanted, and giving you more extension, more names, and flexibility. It was incredible. And of course, Aramasa isn't bad either, being another level 4 you can summon or tribute from deck, give you more consistency, more engine, more follow-up, whatever you kind of needed it to do. It means you can play Mitsurugi in a couple different ways. Before it was kind of, I think, only playable in a Ryzel variant. Now we've seen people mess around, and probably will have some success at the YCS, with both Fiendsmith Mitsurugi and Pure Mitsurugi. Here could work because now you have more normal summons to get your engine going, more consistency, and also means more extension. So say you get stopped on your first summon, you can push through it just fine. The deck didn't get much more in terms of disruption, but truthfully, you didn't need that. Ame no, Murakumo, is so phenomenal anyways, that's not what the deck needed. Due to the newfound flexibility and power and numerous number of cards you could play, the deck, yeah, it has the option to be built in several different ways. That being said, with all 3 different versions, I do think that there is a shared weakness amongst all of them. I'd like to say that one version is better into some stuff, but I think they all share a common weakness to this fun card that I've been mulling over for years now. I want you to say it all with me. Droll and Lockbird. Like before, I mean, Mitsurugi was already weak to Droll. That hasn't changed, because even though Habakiri is like a summon from the deck, which in theory is the way to beat Droll, because you have to sack off the card or a monster when you use Habakiri, you're not net increasing the number of monsters in your field. You're just putting them in the graveyard and triggering their effect, which is great because it searches. Oh wait, you can't search. Now, speaking about Mitsurugi, what else does it have a weakness to? Dweller is gone, so people are saying, yes, the pure Mitsu deck can work out. But besides Droll, there are a couple other issues, and this is ones that come up with the rest of the driving forces. I talked about as well, these will be impacting the meta, but in what other way? Well, I think that the Molt Charmies are going to be the key to this format. We've seen some people in online tournaments already playing upwards of 5 to 9 Molt Charmies, even in the main deck. And that's something that I'm kind of eager to try myself, as while most hand traps going second versus Malice feel negligible, the Molt Charmies can do stuff by themselves, and when paired in multiples, can be truly crippling. But now, depending on the hand, Mitsurugi, depending on what you have, can play around any of the Molt Charmies in a certain way, whether it be not something from the grave, not something from the hand, or not something from the deck. However, it is a little hand dependent. Sometimes you can be crippled either way, and they're never really truly useless. You have to make concessions in order to play around the Charmies. So I still think the Charmies are very good against Mitsurugi, and Mitsurugi's claim to fame or reason to play it over Malice should not be that it's better than the Charmies. I don't think it's much better. That being said, that is kind of how I see the top 3 decks in the format right now, with Malice definitely leading the charge, and behind it are Ryzel and Mitsurugi with all of their variants. But outside of those top 3 decks, there are a couple other options I think that can keep up on a somewhat playable level. So I've called them somewhat viable. I'm gonna call these tier 2. I can expect these decks to top the YCS. They can absolutely beat you if they win the roll, or are played well, or get a little lucky. However, these will not be huge factors into the format in terms of how you deck build and prepare for an event. But the first up of these is Mermail Atlantean, a deck that a lot of people wrote off as dead with the hits on the ban list. Dweller and Bahamut Shark weirdly cut off the ability for this deck to make rank 4s and search the Dragoons, at least effectively. You still can do it with Snow Dust Giant, but you aren't doing what you want to do in a deck, which is do 2 things at the same time. I know that makes sense, but why Bahamut attached Dragoons was like crack is because you accomplished the Toad while searching, and I meant if my opponent had Valor, they only dealt with half of the problem. They had Ash for Dragoons, that was only half the problem for them. And when you can split off your plays into 2-pronged attacks or a double threat at the same time, that's when they become truly insane. But the deck ended up still performing well at YCS Mexico City. Its ability to push through fields going second is something to not be forgotten, as well as when it goes first, its end field isn't bad either, and you maintain the option to go for the Barrier Statue lock, which if Floodgate's the name of the game and people aren't playing much Breakers or Disruption, then that could still be a way to cheese victory extremely easy. And you can put up non-target protection thanks to your Mermail 3. So yeah, this deck is still something you have to be careful of, and the deck's card quality has still gone down since the ban list. So I do think this deck is still viable, as it can play into some fields better than people expect. It's still not going to keep up to the same level of power, consistency, and flexibility that the other decks do. Similarly, another deck that has been really popping off lately, and the winner of the last 2 ICS events, is Momento. Memento is well noted for its pretty impressive ability to make a field that is almost unbreakable. It feels not that much. You'll see an SP with a combined creation face down with 2 quick play spells, and you'll think, pah, what is that? But in truth, their ability to nuke the field 3 or 4 times is not something you can underestimate. It means you cannot establish a field against them, and even decks that are otherwise good into removal, like say Mermail sometimes or Ryzel, will run out of bodies and will just still lose. And Memento's crazy follow-up means that even if you clear the field afterwards and you're not able to kill, the Memento follow-up will just put you back into your place soon after. Now, this deck does have a weakness, and that is, at least from what I've been told by everybody else, its mouse matchup isn't great. For one, White Binder is criminal versus the deck. You banish 3 cards in the grave, and of course that starves cards like Memento Fusion and Combined Creation. It also makes them hard to get back. For one, your only way to get them back is Akihiron, which isn't always that easy to trigger. Yes, you can do it, it's not that hard, but sometimes it requires you going out of your way. And furthermore, if they White Binder both Akihiron plus like Combined Creation at the same time, well, then you kind of just lose. And that for me is kind of scary. However, the deck does have one other edge, and I think that is its ability to play into the Charmies and Droll is pretty nice. None of those cards do nothing against Memento. They will still impact some of their plays, either requiring more extension or requiring them to end on a little bit less in the field. But for the most part, Memento can deal with these rather effectively. These aren't going to be complete shutouts, where if I'm playing Fiendsmith cards, for example, Thualos can be absolutely destructive. Memento, I can make do with it in most cases without giving too much to my opponent. And this kind of immunity to the best non-engine in the format kind of draw me to this deck as a somewhat viable option. I'm putting this deck in somewhat viable for now because I think it has some strong pros, but also some really strong cons. Next up, I got Fiendsmith Engine, and this is not really a deck. I don't really know where to put this, but I wanted to talk about Fiendsmith in general. And Fiendsmith obviously comes in many iterations. We've seen it in Mitsurugi, we've seen it in Ryzel, and we've seen it by itself or with cash cards, with muskets, with Bestials. It comes in many shapes and forms and sizes. But how does it shape up now? Well, I think if everyone is playing all the Charmy cards, then it can be kind of annoying for the engravers. Now, obviously, Perulia is not a big problem, but Thualos, it definitely is. It's absolutely huge for Fiendsmith cards. And that's the reason we saw the initial drop-off of Fiendsmith cards with the release of Rage of the Abyss. But Meows isn't nothing either. It can definitely be very annoying to deal with Meows going through Engraver. And then if you're trying to go into Monday plays, it does require you to forgo some options, especially if your deck is already doing other stuff with the graveyard besides just the Fiendsmith stuff. The other problem with Fimith stuff is usually if you're playing more of a pure deck, you're not ending on that much else. It's kind of like Caesar with the trap and pass, which isn't nothing, but it means a high power extension can kind of churn through you. A deck like Mitsurugi, Rizal, and Malice might have the power to just run right through you. X Rizal kind of invalidates Caesar. It's been a problem for a while. And then Malice before had a hard time versus Caesar, but now has more extenders and more names to go through it. Mitsurugi has also gotten more names and more capability to churn through a Caesar, meaning your field hasn't improved at all while their engines have. But it's not all negatives for Fimith, because if you're pairing these alongside other engines, say Rizal, and you're able to get Caesar up next detonator, then it is for sure enough to win games. You don't really need more than that. Especially if people are cutting down on cards like Imperm and Ash and Valor, it means that the one card ice combo is now even more likely to resolve than it was before. And then there's one other upside to the Fimith package, and that is that they are pretty bad into Bestials, but Bestials aren't really around. So before Bestials were popular because Fiendsmith was everywhere, but if the main decks aren't incorporating Fiendsmith as much anymore, they don't space as much anymore, then Bestials fall off. The other time Bestials were popular is because they're extenders and Malice. With Malice getting new tools, we're not going to expect to see much Bestials in their deck. So that means that the Engravers and Lacrimas and all of your Fiendsmith friends are a lot more likely to resolve and not get banished as the format progresses, which is a stark contrast from a mere week or two ago, where I'd argue a lot of decks had a high number of Bestials in them, specifically for the Fiendsmiths and their grind game potential. Still though, White Binder exists, Malice exists, the Charmies and Drolls still do hurt, and overall that leaves me with Fiendsmith in a position where it is viable, but it's not something I'm pushing to include in every deck like I would have, say, 6 months ago. Next up on this list, I want to talk to you guys about Blue Eyes, the Blue Eyes White Dragon. Yep, so a very popular deck in Master right now, and a deck that never really took off in the TCG. This deck has been kind of fabled to have a bad Malice matchup, but as somebody who's played it a fair bit, I don't really see why it's bad. Yeah, going second against Malice sucks, but it sucks with every deck. If you fool yourself into thinking Rizal's good against Malice going second, I don't know what you're smoking. Blue Eyes is the same position from that spot, right? Like, it's not the Blue Eyes cards that are going to help them that much. It's the non-engine. When you go first with the Blue Eyes, your matchup feels fine. You have removal and you have negates. You can really go about it flexibly to stop them between your Ultimate Spirit for negates, Drill Beam for removal or negates, the Hieratic Seal for more removal, and the Majesty for more removal. You're not really shorting on removal, and that's exactly what I'm looking for against Malice, so that's not a problem. Now, the other problem I have with this deck, however, is the fact that the way of traditionally playing this is with a bunch of the value hand traps, which, if we kind of established, aren't very good right now. Cards like Ash, Imperm, Dominus Purge, whatnot. And yeah, it's Blue Eyes is left kind of playing not great non-engine. So for me, this is like only somewhat viable because it can be built in a way that picks off all the other decks in the format relatively well. But when it gets paired into Malice, you're kind of fighting an uphill battle that is dodgeable in a lot of cases, or requires you to sack out a land, see your opponent to brick some of the games. And when your deck is worst matchup is the most popular deck of the format, it's kind of scary. So for me, Blue Eyes is sitting in that tier 2, somewhat viable position. Lastly, I have one of the deck from this list that got a bunch of support, or well, 2 cards of support, in the brand new Alliance Insight. One that I've seen rumblings of online, but also not that much of, and that is Evil Twins, or Live Twins, whichever one you prefer. Fresh out of Alliance Impacts, we got a brand new Link one for this deck, and a brand new little Live Twin that can act as, what do you call it, protection for your effects, or extension while in the grave. And the very cool thing about, or I don't know how cool it is, but the very interesting thing about these Live Twin cards is that the Link one is a Light and a Fiend. So it lets you access the Fiendsmith engine pretty easily, and that is something that's worth noting. Now, obviously, I talked about how the Fiendsmith cards are worse than they were before, but again, they still are viable as an engine, and that definitely helps the Twins out. You can make fields like Desiree plus Trouble Sunny, or we can build past it and go into another Fiend support from recent times, and that is Bawa Q. And then obviously the follow-up of the Fiendsmith cards, the recycling of the Fiendsmith cards, and some of the follow-up of the Live Twin cards give you a pretty strong grind game that's quite impressive. There's a reason this deck isn't higher on this list, especially without Bistrals here, and it's because every single Charmy hurts you. Perulia is probably the worst against you, surprisingly, despite being a twin deck, because you wouldn't play sprites in this. Fulos hurts a lot for very obvious reasons. You go through your extra deck like maybe 15 times. Okay, that's a lot, not 15, but a lot. But then you've also got Meow's hurting you a bunch because you revive off of the Evil Twin Links, you revive off of Fiendsmith cards, you revive off Trouble Sunny, you revive off of Bow. It's like, what, 7 cards to my opponent? Like, that's terrible. I think, ironically, if the format moves back to a hand trap war type of thing, this deck's ability to push through hand traps is pretty impressive. It's also pretty good into breakers, but it feels like Malice, where it's worse into the Charmies, but even worse into the Charmies. But it's also, its field is worse and its follow-up is worse than Malice. So it almost feels like weird that it's just worse Malice. But when you, obviously, if you play the deck and you actually like sit down against it and read all the cards, it reads nothing like Malice. But that Live Twin to me is only somewhat viable. Let me know if you want to see content of Live Twin on the channel. I think the deck has potential. I would not be surprised if it takes a few top cut spots at the YCS and continues to for future events in the Alliance Inside season, but I do think it lacks what it really needs to push itself to the top, as it's going to be caught in the crosshairs of the Malice hate in the current format's non-engine. That wraps up the somewhat viable decks of the current format. There are a couple other decks that I think will struggle, but can get there to a YCS top cut in your regional top, and for sure get an invite with. First up is Fire King. Good old Dinkabui's Fire Kings. I love this deck, but I don't have the balls to play it in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! And the fact that other people do and do successfully with it is kind of impressive. That being said, I feel like he's gone on record saying Malice is a bad matchup, and this is same as the Blue Eyes and Memento thing all over again. I don't want to play decks that have a bad matchup into the best deck and most popular deck. And this deck got no new support, obviously, so there's not much more to discuss. I guess the one upside here is that the Charmies aren't great against this deck, but Fire King didn't have too much of a hard time versus the old hand traps like Valor, Imperm, or Ash either, so I don't know how much of a win that really is for this deck. That being said, I'm not wanting to queue into Malice for this, and I'm not sure what advantage there is to bring this over any other deck to a tournament, so yeah, for me, I'm going to leave it as a deck that'll struggle, like the tier 3 section, but maybe it'll get somewhere. Next up on this list is a deck that got some support from the brand new Alliance Insight, and that is White Forest. A deck that, truthfully, I'm excited to play and kind of learn myself. It got a bunch of support, including a new field spell that searches and some more synchros and a bunch of other cards that maybe are less important, but still, White Forest, they get a meaningful increase with the set. But whenever we look at a deck and it's getting support, we have to always keep in mind one thing. If it got better, how did it get better? For White Forest, the biggest problem always felt like removal, which made going second really hard, and I don't think that's changed at all. The field spell is still weak into cards like Detonator, and even though it gets you a little bit more because you can search LZs, it doesn't really increase your ceiling, just a bit of the consistency a bit. And it's not enough for me to think that this deck is more powerful or higher on the list than it was before. Now, part of me has considered this as it can play okay into the Charmies, but it's not great either into them. Your half fields are honestly like Malice half fields, so it's not really much more of a an upside. Its follow-up is good, but just like talking with Live Twin, its follow-up is not as good as Malice's, and it just feels like another case of a combo deck that's not good into removal, like Vanadium. As well as this deck is a bit weaker into Droll and Lockbird, where Malice does not have that problem. I think this deck's bigger advantage would be the fact that you can get people by surprise, and it is very easy to blunder into White Forest, where if you don't know how to play against the cards, you can lose very easily, because the punish game is very strong, especially with a card like Silvera that just books the entire field. But still, it doesn't make me want to play this deck. It's a going first combo deck that is really not that going a second. And unlike Malice, it is not great into negation. It's not bad, but it's not phenomenal. And I think it has more of a choke point on cards like LZs than, say, a March Hare in Malice. And because of that, I do think that this White Force deck is not the right pick for this event. So I'm going to keep it in the Will Struggle section with Fire King. Also here I've got Ubell, and this is one that's been slowly ticking down and down the list as time passes, which is natural for a deck as formats proceed and a deck doesn't get new cards or gets hit on the ban list, but everything else gets better. Ubell, to me, when it goes first, can still do a lot. However, the Charmies and Droll, while not death sentences, do hurt this deck a fair bit. So I don't think this deck is particularly well poised. That being said, its raw power that it still maintains does mean that you can't completely counter it out. If it goes first, if it draws the right non-engine, it can for sure win games. And you can play a healthy amount of non-engine in this deck, right? You can play all 9 Charmies and say, F it. So this deck is not completely useless just now. I would not throw this into your storage bin and say, I'm never playing this again, because you could very easily still get your invite in a regional, maybe even top, if you throw this deck together. Similarly, we got Rescue Ace, the Rescue Ass. So yeah, this is a deck that I'd put as completely shit before, I'm pretty sure. And I'm usually pretty harsh in this deck. I'm a big Rescue Ace hater, if anything. I've always hated the bricks in this deck. It always felt rather clunky to me, and I've never been a big fan. However, this deck notoriously is pretty good against cards like Fualos and the other Charmies, as well as Droll, because with a single choke point around Turbulence, you can just rush to that and trigger that with 1 or 2 draws or without getting to Droll pretty safely. Now, in order to make it truly safe to the negation cards, there's ways to extend, like with SP or Princess, and that's how the deck ended up being good against both those types of disruptions. However, if you mix a Fulos with like an Imperm, that's when it gets kind of hard for this deck. Still, if we aren't seeing many cards like Imperm or Ash, or just less of them in the metagame, and there's just more Charmies like I'm kind of predicting there will be, then Rescue Ace can get a little bit better. And the disruption is pretty good. The Book of Moon off the Preventer, the Pop off Extinguish, the Contain off of Contain, that is not really any card like it, but it all leads to pretty solid removal that I would actually expect Mouse to kind of have a hard time going up against. Now, another deck that I feel like is worth talking about is a deck that I actually think will struggle, but isn't completely worthless, is Regenesis. Regenesis is not viable pure. Let me get that right out of the way. You need to play with other stuff. And the deck that I was eyeing was Kashtira Regenesis. A deck we didn't really get to see in the OCG because cash cards are just heavily hit. But here in the TCG, without Rise Heart, not requiring the extra deck stuff is okay, because that's what the Regenesis cards lock you out of. You instead just go Fenrir and Unicorn and Field Spell, and you control the game state with those. And Unicorn meets the 2500 attack requirement for your Regenesis cards. Regenesis cards are very good in the grind games, and they complement the Kashtira cards well on that. They are pretty good into any form of removal and negation. So value-wise, it's just very hard to outpace them. The way to beat them is to blitz them down and just out-combo them. So that is why things like Mouse, Mitsurugi may still be hard for the deck to deal with. That being said, the Regenesis cards give you some powerful additions. Specifically, the Regenesis Continuous Trap card they have is one of the best cards you'll ever read. It's a once per turn Book of Moon, like Yugioh and Meta Noise. However, it also dumps one from deck to grave like Meta Noise, so you get to search. But then, unlike Meta Noise, you can send it from the field to the graveyard because it's a continuous once per turn. To then soul charge back every graveyard or banished Regenesis monster. So to me, this card is nuts as it gets you to your engine. It's a soul charge and it's good disruption. And this is like the reason to play this deck. The deck does also have an E-Telly, it does have a Stratos, and it does have a Rhoda. Meaning you can't keep the deck very consistent with powerful spells and traps, and then a bunch of one of the searchable cards, the cards you want to search, to make it all line up pretty well. However, the biggest problem with a lot of this is in these type of decks, you want to play the negation hand traps to back it up, and those aren't good right now, and these cards kind of become kind of yuck. These cards are also great against those type of hand traps, so if no one is playing them, you don't get that kind of cool advantage as well. And then one other thing to talk about here is that this deck can play the brand new Dominus card. Point is, that card, which can negate a monster effect and then search a Dominus trap, can be pretty good in a deck like this, especially because that card only restricts you from using effects in the hand or the graveyard the rest of the turn. So if you're pairing this alongside Regenesis cards and Kashtira cards, you're not making too much of a sacrifice. But I think this deck is somewhat cool, and if you want me to explore this on the channel more, then please let me know. It's something I brewed up a little bit. However, I decided ultimately that it'll probably just not keep up against the main 3 decks of the format that I mentioned. Lastly, in decks that will struggle, I got Tempai. Now, Tempai is a deck that has been hit and hammered, and is kind of falling off more and more with each passing event. So maybe this deck could fall even a tier below where I have it right now, but I do think this deck is not completely useless. For one, obviously, Tempai just can OTK with essentially nothing. But this deck can also play the Charmies kind of more fluently than the other deck. Now, one big downside to the Tempai deck is the consistency of this deck has been absolutely shot. As well as if people are playing Thrust into Barrier or Thrust into Sanctum for Lancia, Thrust plus Floodgate as a general answer to the opposing Drolls and Charmies, then Tempai will get hit by that, right? Thrust into Barrier will hurt Tempai a lot. You always hear the Tempai player saying, oh, I can beat Barrier. But no, I'm not going to cope like them. Like, let's be real. So I do think that Tempai has some key potential. It just, the hits are too big, and the Thrust for Barrier thing still exists, kind of stopping me from putting this deck any higher on this list. And lastly, I've got one more tier to go over, and these are the decks I think are either poorly positioned or just outpowered. They are no longer good enough to keep up in the modern landscape. First one is Crestron, a newer strategy, or I guess a newer revitalized strategy. I have never really felt that this was the deck for an event, but I think it's even less so now. And maybe I'll get some hate for this, but this deck, to me, just isn't what I want it to be. Its Mouse matchup must feel abysmal. As well as the deck has always felt kind of weak to Lancia, which will be popular, weak to Charmies, which will be popular, weak to Droll, which will be popular. and I don't see much kind of benefit to playing this type of deck. The upside is that you can be solid in a grind game, but you'll never outpace the true kings in this format like Malice, which are just way better in a grind game because one banish of a white binder and your entire graveyard or their field is either full or your graveyard gone, and that's just nuts. For me, this deck is just outclassed, and until something changes, I don't expect to see more from this. Next up is Snake Eyes, a deck which oddly got a bit of a surge with the ban list. I actually don't know why, because 2 Snake Eye Ash and 2 Poplar, it has to just be worse than 3 Bonfire. Still, it topped Mexico City. It did well the French Open. It seemed like this deck may be poised to make a comeback. I don't get it. I think this deck is still not where it needs to be. It lacks the bridge between Diabell Star and Snake Eye cards. The board has gotten weaker as well. It's still weak in the Charmies. You have a lot of breaks in the deck. Its extension got worse with Bonfire 1. It's not good, in my opinion. I would not play this deck. For now, this is a rogue at best deck. I'm not expecting this deck at the top. Next on this list is a deck that I had high hopes for, truthfully, and it floundered pretty sadly. And that is the Odeon or Anubis deck. A fair bit of players actually brought this to YCS Houston, and the conversion rate on it was pretty bad. A lot of the good players who brought this ended up not converting its top cut. And it only gets worse from here because Fimith the cards are getting kind of outsped a little bit. I think that does hurt the Anubis cards that were using them, as well as the Malice ability to rip apart back row kind of unprovoked and a banish, not even a popping sort of fashion, is almost impossible to deal with. MTP and Cryptor, just Anubis cannot be expected to keep up with this. And then even if you go first, I don't know if you have enough to really keep off Malice. You probably do, but I think we missed the mark for the Odeon deck to be playable. Maybe if it gets 1 or 2 more new cards, it can kind of be pushed back, but for now I don't see it. Next up is a Labyrinth, the deck which had a surprise success in YCS Houston. And then I know people were messing around with it afterwards, especially with the ban list. And while Labyrinth always seems to sneak away some success into the format, I don't think it's well positioned here at all. And this is a similar problem to Odeon, and we'll get back to this later, but trap decks against the non-targeting multi-banishes of Malice feels miserable. Your grind game will be ripped apart by Malice as well, and you have to try and suffocate Malice out of the game. That's almost impossible thanks to how powerful the Malice cards are and their ability to float almost infinitely. So yeah, for me this feels like a complete no-no. Next up is the Bisl Fenith deck. So this is kind of something I was going over previously, but Bistils are worse, so I think the Bisl portion of this deck doesn't make sense. You were playing it before because you got to play all the Fenith cards, and then the Bisl cards are good for value games versus slow decks, but also the Bistils are good versus Fenith cards. So when you have all of that paired together, you get a catch-all good card deck. But with Bistils phasing out and Fenith cards getting worse, this is definitely not where you want to be, and the power level of this deck is nowhere high enough to ward off the attack of a Mitsu or a Malice deck. Next up, we got a couple mid-range decks from past formats that I think are now just being kind of overtaken or outpaced. Voiceless Voice, Centurion, Salmon Greats, all kind of fall into this just overpowered or outpowered deck now, where I think you can't keep up with Malice and Ryzel. They're just too much, and that's obviously rough. As well as with the hand traps these decks would use, like Valor, Imperm, Ash, Ogre getting worse, it means that type of strategy does just become less reliable. So for now, these are decks I would not play. Ritual Beast is another example of a deck that gets caught in the crossfire by everything. With no new support for this deck, it is just the same as it was, but you get hit pretty hard by things like Charmies and Drolls, and it's pretty much every Charmy for this deck. It means I can't be bothered bringing this into a tournament. Oh, and Lancia too, and Barrier. Oh god, this is... Ritual Beast just gets caught by every single Lingering Floodgate. Poor Ritual Beast players, the one person, Herman, who's out there. Then we got 2 other new decks from Alliance Insight that I feel like I needed to address that I think unfortunately just are nowhere going to be enough in terms of keeping up. First up is Dragon Rulers. They have a bunch of new support that honestly looked very enticing. It ends up falling flat, where being hit by all the Lingering Floodgates like Lancia, Droll, and Charmies definitely hurts this deck. It's also the fact that this deck needs to be built like an engine deck, where because everything requires multi-card combos, 2 to 3 or more, you have to play a lot of engine, which isn't always the end of the world, but those decks need to be able to push through disruption very effectively if you're not going to be relying on an engine. And I'm not convinced Dragon Ruler can do that. So between having that problem and the weakness to the Lingering Floodgates, I don't think this is a great call for the event. Although I am looking forward to exploring it, and I can assure you guys, there will be a Dragon Ruler video on this channel soon. Just stay tuned for that. And lastly, just like Live Twins, this deck got some support. It is Eldritch from the same kind of era, although I guess it's a different deck build pack. It's Labyrinth and Odeon all over again. The new support in the stack does make it more grindy, so it's better in a long game, and your disruption is better. But the problems of going second into a deck like Malice don't just dissipate. While you can maybe hold off their offensive a little bit if you go first, going second is going to be nigh impossible still, and going first still isn't a complete walk in the park. For me, this deck is still completely outclassed and overpowered. All they've done is given this deck some more life into Rogue, so they can bring it up from maybe tier 5 to tier 4. But I don't think it holds a candle to the other decks that are higher up in the list. But okay, guys, that is my list for this current format. Stay tuned for the upcoming weeks as we talk about the best tech cards, as well as I'll have a chance to digest the information we've learned from YCS Rhode Island. I'm also curious to see if my predictions and opinions will hold up to what actually plays out at the YCS. It's hard to know exactly sometimes, especially with a brand new format and one that is a rather drastic change. As well, someone could just innovate a brand new strategy that completely throws this list out of order. But I think that overall leaves the format in a pretty unique position where we haven't seen anything like it before. I don't think I like it that much, but we'll see. I'll let time be the judge of that. I'm nervous though. But yeah, let me know what you guys think and stay tuned for future videos. See ya.